Kill your lights on Boiling Springs Bridge, and something climbs into your cab, dripping river water. When you turn around, you don't see a bridge, you see gates. If you love real road legends, tap subscribe and tell me your state below. Before we go any deeper into this nightmare of a tale, I need you to do something for me. Hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any of the stories we bring you week after week. Drop a like on this video if you're feeling what you're hearing, and more importantly, comment below and tell me exactly where you're watching from. What state, what country, what part of the world are you in right now? Your comments matter to us, and we genuinely want to know who's out there listening to these stories with us. Who else out there can't look away from the dark stuff that most people pretend doesn't exist? What you're about to hear is the story of James Mitchell, a 52-year-old trucker with over 3 decades behind the wheel, a guy who'd logged more miles than most people drive in a lifetime. James wasn't the type to believe in ghost stories or urban legends. He'd heard them all 1,000 times over at rest stops and truck stops scattered across the country. Stories about phantom hitchhikers, mysterious hitchhikers who disappeared from back seats, roads that loop back on themselves, bridges that shouldn't exist according to any map. But James had never believed any of it, not really. Not until one specific night in late October when he found himself stopped on the Boiling Springs Bridge. And that's when everything he thought he knew got completely torn apart. This is his story, or at least what we know of it, which honestly isn't much. James Mitchell had driven practically every secondary route, every alternate highway, and every abandoned back road in the continental United States during those 30 years he spent behind the wheel. He knew which rest stops served actual edible food, which ones you should avoid entirely, which small towns had friendly cops, and which ones would harass you just for stopping. He'd memorized patterns and routes that didn't show up on most GPS systems, shortcuts that could shave hours off a haul if you knew exactly where you were going. But there was one stretch of road that James had always managed to avoid when the sun started setting, one route he'd deliberately gone around for years without ever really admitting to himself why. That route led through Boiling Springs, Pennsylvania, and more specifically, it went directly over the Boiling Springs Bridge. On the evening of October 28, 2023, James found himself unable to avoid it. He'd taken a detour to fix a blown-out tire on the shoulder of the highway. He'd gotten caught in unexpected construction that forced him off the main routes. There'd been a multi-vehicle collision on the interstate that backed everything up for miles, leaving him no choice but to take increasingly older, increasingly remote back roads just to make any kind of forward progress. And by the time he'd navigated through all those obstacles, by the time the sun was dropping lower on the horizon with each passing mile, James realized he was going to hit that bridge right as the light was fading, right when the blue-gray twilight was giving way to genuine darkness. As James drove deeper into the Pennsylvania mountains, he started noticing things that shouldn't have been there, things that didn't add up. The cell service on his phone kept cutting in and out, like something was deliberately interfering with the signal, like something didn't want him connected to the outside world. His radio started behaving strangely too. When he'd try to find a station, he'd get nothing but static, a constant hissing that seemed to get worse the closer he got to a particular spot on the map. And then there were the trees. They grew so thick and dense that even though it was still officially afternoon, the light underneath the canopy was the grey-green murk of late evening. James found his mind drifting back to stories he'd dismissed over the years, stories he'd written off as hallucinations brought on by too many hours alone in the cab. There was the story about the guy in Nebraska who swore he saw a grey figure just standing in the middle of the road, in the dead of night, right in his lane, and when his headlights hit it, the figure just disappeared like smoke. There was the story from a woman in Texas about how she got chased by a black pickup truck with no license plate for over 40 miles, the driver never making a move to actually hit her, just maintaining a perfect distance behind her, just following, just present. And most relevant to what he was facing right now, there were the stories about the Boiling Springs Bridge, stories about cars leaving the road, about people disappearing, about something at that specific location that didn't quite follow the normal rules of reality. The bridge appeared through the gathering mist like something from a horror movie, materialized out of the fog that was starting to roll through the valley as James descended deeper into the mountain passes. And the moment he saw it, the moment his eyes registered what he was looking at, James felt it. That gut-level warning signal that tells you to turn around, find another way, do literally anything but proceed forward. The bridge was old, seriously old, the kind of structure that had probably been built sometime in the early 20th century and hadn't been properly maintained in decades. The iron was rust-stained, the wooden sections were grey and weathered, and the whole thing had a feeling to it that went beyond just looking run down. There was concrete barriers blocking most of the access and warning tape strung everywhere. But James knew that truckers who regularly used this route could navigate around those obstacles if they needed to. What bothered him wasn't the physical condition of the bridge. What bothered him was something else entirely, something he couldn't quite pin down, but could definitely feel. It was like the air around the bridge was charged with something, like standing too close to electrical wires, like the very atmosphere had been contaminated by something ancient and malevolent. It wasn't a rational fear, it was something deeper, something that came from a part of his brain that was concerned with pure survival. James's truck started making noise as he approached the bridge, a grinding sound that hadn't been there before, a mechanical protest that seemed to say, "Don't go." But when he pulled over to inspect the engine, he couldn't find anything wrong. The sound disappeared the moment he shut down the engine. But the damage was done. James was on edge now, every nerve ending firing warnings, his instincts screaming at him to gun it, to get across the bridge as fast as possible and leave this place in his dust. Against every instinct, against logic, against the very real sense of dread that was sitting in his chest like a stone, James made a decision. He pulled into the small emergency parking area just before the bridge entrance. The kind of space that's designed for truckers or regular drivers who need to pull over when something feels wrong. He shut off the engine. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the engine noise had been, and that's when he saw it. Standing right in the middle of the bridge, roughly halfway across the span, was a person, a man. And he was completely soaked, absolutely drenched, like he'd just stepped out of the river. His clothes were hanging off him in heavy, wet folds. Water was literally dripping off his body, running down his arms and legs in small streams. His hair was plastered to his face, and he was just standing there, motionless, watching. James's heart slammed hard against his ribs, a sudden spike of adrenaline that made his hands shake on the steering wheel. He hadn't seen this person when he'd approached the bridge. There'd been no vehicle, no sign of anyone on the structure at all. This man had either been standing there the entire time, invisible somehow, or he'd appeared out of nothing, materialized from the fog and the gathering darkness, like he was made from the mist itself. James forced himself to move, forced himself out of the cab, even though every cell in his body was telling him to get back inside, start the engine, and drive away from this place as fast as his rig would carry him. He grabbed a flashlight, clicked it on, and the beam cut through the darkness, but it barely reached the bridge, the light seeming to get swallowed up by the mist and the shadows. The soaked man didn't move. James lifted his hand in what he hoped was a non-threatening gesture and called out, asking if the guy was okay, asking if he'd been in an accident, asking if he needed help or if James should call emergency services. His voice sounded strange out here, muffled somehow, like the very air was absorbing the sound before it could travel far. The man didn't respond. He didn't move. He didn't give any indication that he'd even heard James speak. James called out again, louder this time, but still nothing. The figure remained in that exact same position, water continuing to pour off him in steady streams. And James felt the dread in his chest shift into something more primal, something that transcended rational thought and went straight to the survival instinct hardwired into his nervous system. James had started walking back toward his truck, keeping his eyes locked on the figure, half expecting it to do something, anything, but it just stayed there, frozen in place like a statue made of water and silence. James was almost back to the cab when the figure moved. Not slowly, not gradually, but with shocking speed, it spun around to face directly at James. Even from the distance between them, even in the near-total darkness, James somehow knew that those eyes were looking directly at him. He could feel the weight of that gaze like a physical pressure. He could feel that those eyes belonged to something that had been dead for a very long time, something that had been trapped and waiting, something that had finally gotten the attention it had been seeking. James wanted to run. His body wanted to run. But his legs had other ideas, and he found himself frozen, unable to move, unable to do anything but stare back at the figure on the bridge. There was no voice, no words, no sound at all, but somehow James understood. He understood with the kind of absolute certainty that doesn't require explanation, doesn't require logic, doesn't require anything except knowing. He understood that what he was looking at was not a living person in any conventional sense. He understood that this was something that had died violently and suddenly, something that had remained bound to this place for reasons he couldn't fathom, something that had been waiting in the darkness and the mist for someone like James to come along. James felt tears start to stream down his face, not from fear exactly, but from a sudden flood of compassion for whatever this thing was, whatever it had been before it became this. It had been human once. It had lived and loved and made plans and dreamed about the future, and then something catastrophic had happened on this bridge, and now it was trapped here. And James was suddenly certain of that fact, with the kind of knowledge that bypassed his rational mind entirely. James's voice, when it came out, was raw, cracked but sincere. "Are you okay? Can I help you? Is there something you need?" The figure still didn't answer in any conventional way, but then, very slowly, it raised one arm. It extended that arm straight out in front of it, and the finger on that extended hand pointed directly at James. Not at his truck, not at the road, but specifically at James himself. That simple gesture, a gesture that kids made, that people made 100 times a day without thinking, carried such an enormous weight of meaning that James felt it like a physical blow. That pointing seemed to carry accusation, seemed to carry a message, seemed to communicate something vast and important that James's conscious mind couldn't quite translate into words. Then the figure began to fade, not like someone running away, not like someone being obscured by fog, but literally dissolving, becoming transparent, becoming less solid, losing definition and form until finally, in just a few seconds, the figure was completely gone. There was nothing left but the sound of the wind through the bridge's iron structure and the distant sound of water flowing in the river below. James stood there in the darkness, unable to move, unable to process, his mind trying desperately to find rational explanations for what he'd just witnessed. tired hallucination, optical illusion from the mist and shadows. Someone playing an extremely elaborate prank. But his gut, his deeper instincts, they all knew the truth. He'd just encountered something genuinely supernatural, something that had crossed over from wherever spirits exist into the material world, specifically to contact him. It took James several minutes to get his legs working again, to get himself back into the cab of his truck, to get the engine started. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely grip the steering wheel. He drove across that bridge at a crawl, keeping both hands planted firmly on the wheel, trying not to look at anything except the road immediately in front of him. The moment the front of his truck cleared the far side of the bridge, he accelerated hard, pushing the truck to speeds that were probably dangerous on a road as poorly maintained as this one, needing distance, needing to put as much space as possible between himself and that structure. He drove straight through Boiling Springs without stopping, didn't even slow down, just kept pushing forward until the mountains started to flatten out and the density of the trees decreased and he could finally breathe normally again. He didn't stop until he found a truck stop about 2 hours down the road, and when he did, he pulled into the lot, parked in a well-lit area, and sat there in the cab for hours, unable to sleep, unable to do anything but replay what he'd seen over and over in his mind. When daylight finally came, James made a decision that surprised him. He wasn't the type of guy to go digging into local history or seeking out information about paranormal happenings. He was practical, pragmatic, a guy who dealt with concrete things like mechanical problems and logistics and route planning. But he couldn't leave this alone. The image of that soaked, pointing figure was burned into his memory. The feeling of that communication, that direct connection to something beyond normal understanding, it wouldn't let him go. So James did something he'd rarely done before. He actually went to a public library. He found one in a town called Boiling Springs, the actual town that the bridge was named after, and he walked up to the information desk and asked if they had any records about the bridge, any historical information, any documentation of incidents that had occurred there. The librarian who helped him was a woman in her early 60s, and the moment James started asking his questions, she seemed to know exactly what he was after. It was like she'd been waiting for someone to ask, like other people had come in before with the same questions, like this was a regular occurrence. Her name was Margaret, and she spent the next several hours pulling old newspaper archives, digging through microfiche, and laying out a history that had been deliberately buried and forgotten by the people in power in this small town. What she found was a tragedy that had happened on June 30th, 1995. A young couple, David and Sarah Chen, both in their early 20s, newlyweds returning from a honeymoon, had been driving across the Boiling Springs Bridge when their car had suddenly accelerated, broken through the guardrail, and plummeted 40 meters down into the river below. The car was recovered from the water, but the bodies of David and Sarah were never found. They simply disappeared into the depths of the river, leaving behind only questions and mystery. According to Margaret, there were witnesses who'd seen the car that night. They said it had been traveling at a normal speed, nothing erratic, nothing suggesting the driver had lost control or was in any kind of distress. But then, within seconds of entering the bridge, the car had suddenly accelerated to an extreme speed, like the driver had floored the gas pedal all the way down. One witness had claimed to see not one car but two going over the edge, as if there'd been a second vehicle involved, as if the collision had been intentional rather than accidental. But the second vehicle had disappeared before police arrived, leaving only questions and speculation. The case had never been officially solved. Without the bodies, without a way to perform autopsies, investigators couldn't determine what had actually caused the accident. Whether David had suffered some kind of medical emergency, whether there'd been a struggle between the two of them, whether a second vehicle had actually been involved, none of it could be confirmed. Margaret then showed James article after article from the years following the Chen accident. There were other incidents, other cars going off the bridge, other deaths, not identical to the first incident, but sharing similar elements, always at night. Always under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Always with witnesses reporting strange activity, figures that appeared out of nowhere, sounds of screaming coming from the water, vehicles being pursued by trucks with no license plates. The articles had become less frequent over time, Margaret explained, not because the incident stopped, but because the local newspaper had received pressure from the town government to stop covering the story. Publishing articles about a haunted bridge, they'd been told, was perpetuating an urban legend that hurt tourism and scared away business. So the coverage had stopped. The story had been officially buried. But Margaret suspected that was because the people in power had figured out something about the bridge that frightened them enough to want the story forgotten. When Margaret had tried to find out why the bridge had never been demolished, why it still stood despite being declared structurally unsafe, she'd been given evasive answers and bureaucratic runarounds, complicating factors, funding issues, structural concerns that made demolition too dangerous. But Margaret, who'd lived her entire life in Boiling Springs and worked in this library for 4 decades, had her own theory. She believed that someone, somewhere in the local government hierarchy, had concluded that the bridge itself was actually serving a purpose, that it was functioning as a barrier or a seal of some kind, holding back something that would be infinitely worse if it was released. She leaned in close to James, looked around to make sure no one else was in the archive room, and told him a theory that would completely upend his understanding of what he'd seen on that bridge. Margaret said she believed the bridge was a portal, a weak point in reality where the physical world and something else, some other dimension or realm, were touching and overlapping. According to research she'd seen from paranormal investigators, research that was never published formally, the bridge had been built directly over a location that Native American cultures had identified as spiritually significant, a place where the barrier between worlds was particularly thin. That significance hadn't disappeared with time. If anything, it had grown stronger, and the bridge, which had been built without any awareness of that significance, had essentially become a conduit, a channel through which things from that other side could occasionally break through and interact with our world. The Chen accident, Margaret theorized, hadn't just been an accident. It had been an opening, a moment when something had reached out from the other side and made contact, and that contact had been strong enough that it left marks, left echoes, left a permanent wound in the fabric of reality at that location. Despite everything Margaret had told him, despite his own terrifying experience, James found that he couldn't simply walk away and forget about the bridge. He tried. For the first few days after leaving the library, he really did try to put it all behind him, to go back to his normal routine, to convince himself that what he'd experienced was just stress and exhaustion playing tricks on his mind. But he couldn't do it. The curiosity was eating at him. Every night, lying in his bunk in the back of his cab or in whatever motel he'd pulled into, his mind would replay the scene. The soaked figure, the pointed finger, the silent communication that had somehow felt more real than any conversation he'd ever had. Within a week, James had started spending hours online, diving into paranormal forums, reading accounts from other people who claimed to have experienced something strange at the bridge. He posted his own account, sanitized slightly to avoid sounding completely insane, and he waited for responses. The responses came from people all over, people who'd had similar experiences, people who'd seen things at the bridge that they couldn't explain, people who were clearly convinced that something genuinely supernatural was happening at that location. One particular person reached out to him through private messages, someone with the username VeiledWatcher22, who claimed to be a paranormal researcher with nearly a decade of experience investigating the Boiling Springs Bridge specifically. This person had information that Margaret hadn't mentioned, information that suggested the portal at the bridge wasn't a recent development caused by the Chen accident. It had apparently been active for centuries, possibly longer. What the Chen accident had done was amplify it, strengthen it, make it much more active and much more dangerous. Veiled Watcher 22 suggested that David and Sarah Chen hadn't just died in an accident, they'd been used as conduits, their deaths serving to strengthen the connection between the physical world and whatever existed on the other side. And in the nearly 3 decades that had passed since their deaths, that connection had been growing steadily stronger, and with it, the number of entities that were able to cross over and manifest in the physical world. Veiled Watcher 22 laid out several competing theories for what was actually happening at the bridge. One theory suggested that the bridge was functioning as a kind of spiritual vortex, a place where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds had worn thin enough that spirits of the dead, particularly those who died violently and traumatically, could manifest and interact with the living. Another theory suggested that it was genuinely a dimensional portal, a point where 2 different realities were overlapping, where beings and creatures from another dimension could theoretically cross over into ours. The third theory, and this was the one that seemed to disturb Veiled Watcher 22 the most, was that there might actually be an alternate version of Boiling Springs, a version that existed in a different layer of reality, a version that had been corrupted or cursed somehow, and that the bridge was the connection point between the 2 versions, a bridge that literally and figuratively connected 2 different realities. After weeks of back-and-forth communication, Veiled Watcher 22 made James an offer. There was going to be a coordinated investigation of the bridge on October 28th, exactly 28 years after the Chen accident, a date that Veiled Watcher 22 claimed would be particularly significant for paranormal activity. Veiled Watcher 22 had assembled a team, a professional paranormal investigator named Dr. Robert Hammond, with impressive credentials, a local sensitive named Carmen Rodriguez, who claimed to be able to communicate with spirits, and now potentially James, who had first-hand experience of the phenomena. The investigation would be comprehensive, scientific, documented. This was a chance to actually find answers, to understand what was happening at that bridge, to potentially help other people avoid whatever fate had befallen David and Sarah Chen. James agreed without hesitation. He'd already been consumed by the mystery. This was his chance to actually do something about it. As the date approached, James's obsession didn't diminish, it intensified. He started losing focus on his work. Customers reported late deliveries. He was making mistakes in his logistical planning. His fellow truckers started noticing something was wrong with him, that he seemed distracted, that he wasn't himself. James knew it was happening, knew that he was letting this consume him, but he couldn't stop. Every moment that he wasn't actively working, he was researching, reading forums, studying the history of the bridge, reading about paranormal activity in similar locations. He was convinced that October 28th was going to be the most important night of his life, that the answers he was seeking were finally within reach, that he was about to understand something fundamental about the nature of reality itself. The calendar pages counted down. The date got closer. And James felt like he was being pulled toward that bridge by forces beyond his control, as if something on the other side was calling to him specifically, as if his entire life had been leading up to this specific moment. When October 28th finally arrived, James found himself driving through the same mountain passes, heading toward the same bridge, but this time the conditions were even worse than they'd been during his first encounter. The weather was deteriorating. Clouds were moving in thick and heavy, the wind was picking up, and there was a sense of storm pressure in the air, a feeling that something bad was coming. James had expected the other investigators to meet him at a designated location, but as the time for the rendezvous approached, he started getting a sinking feeling in his stomach. His calls went to voicemail, his texts weren't being answered, emails bounced back. By the time James actually arrived at the bridge, it was clear that none of them were coming. He was completely alone. James pulled into the emergency parking area and shut off the engine. The silence was absolute. The wind howled through the bridge's iron structure, creating a sound that was almost like voices, almost like communication. And James had to remind himself that it was just wind, just the natural sound of air moving through metal and open spaces. But his body didn't believe that reassurance. His heart was hammering, his hands were shaking. He'd brought equipment this time, a video camera that he'd set up to record continuously, an audio recorder, a flashlight with extra batteries, even a small axe for some inexplicable reason, probably just for the psychological comfort of having something that felt like a weapon. He didn't know what good any of it would do against something supernatural, but it was better than nothing. James stepped out of the cab and began walking toward the bridge. The camera was already recording, the red light tiny but visible in the gathering gloom. The audio recorder was running in his jacket pocket. Everything was being documented, everything was being captured, because if he was going to face whatever was on that bridge, he wanted there to be evidence. He wanted there to be proof that he hadn't imagined any of it. As he got closer, he noticed something he'd missed on his first visit. There was wet on the ground, water that hadn't been there before, and more than that, there were footprints in that water, footprints that seemed to lead from the direction of the river and up toward the bridge, and then turned and headed back toward the river again, like someone had walked from the water to the bridge and then back again. James followed the trail with his eyes. It led directly under the bridge and then disappeared, as if whatever had made the footprints had simply ceased to exist on solid ground. James stood at the entrance to the bridge, and that's when he heard it. A voice, but not with his ears exactly. It was more like the voice was being transmitted directly into his brain, bypassing his auditory system entirely. The voice was whispering, the same word over and over, don't, don't, don't. A warning, an imperative. A desperate plea from someone who desperately wanted him to turn around and leave this place. But James, consumed by his obsession, consumed by his need to understand, forced his feet forward onto the wooden planks of the bridge. The structure groaned beneath his weight, a sound that was genuinely painful, like the bridge itself was suffering from his presence. James moved slowly, methodically, deeper into the structure, documenting everything, recording everything, his camera and audio recorder capturing every sound, every movement, every moment of what was about to happen. James made it to approximately the middle of the bridge, the exact spot where he'd seen the first figure during his initial encounter, and he stopped. He waited, and they came. Not one figure this time, but dozens of them, materializing out of the darkness and the mist, like they'd been waiting in the spaces between reality, just on the other side of visibility, waiting for the right moment to manifest. They were all soaked, all drenched, all dripping water from clothes that hung loose on bodies that had been in the water for a very long time. Their skin was pale, almost blue-white. Their eyes were hollow and empty, and yet despite the emptiness in those eyes, there was intent, there was purpose. There was something ancient and patient and genuinely malevolent looking out through them. James recognized one of the faces, David Chen, according to the photograph Margaret had shown him. And next to him, presumably, was Sarah Chen, her features distorted by whatever had happened to her presence feeling less human with each passing second. The figure that James recognized as David Chen stepped forward, and as it approached, the temperature dropped so drastically that James's breath came out in thick clouds of vapor, his vision starting to blur from the cold. When David Chen spoke, it wasn't with his mouth. The words appeared directly in James's mind, forming thoughts that weren't his own, that were being injected directly into his consciousness. "You were chosen," the voice continued. "You can see us because we want you to see us. You can hear us because we've chosen to speak to you. You've been marked since the moment you first encountered us, and tonight is the night when that mark becomes complete." David Chen moved even closer until he and James were nearly touching, and the temperature dropped even further, so cold that James could feel his lungs burning with each breath. So cold that it felt like the very blood in his veins was beginning to freeze. The voice in his mind became clearer, more defined, more urgent. "You have a choice, James Mitchell. A choice that you'll need to make in this moment, because you won't get another one. You can turn around right now. You can walk back to your truck. You can drive away from this place, and with time, all of this will fade like a dream. The memories will dissolve. It'll be like none of this ever happened. Your life will go back to normal. You'll drive your routes. You'll spend your nights alone on the road. You'll live out your days as just another trucker passing through, never quite belonging anywhere, always on the move, always alone." The voice paused, and when it continued, there was something seductive in it, something that offered an alternative that was almost tempting. "Or you can come with us. You can come down to the river. You can cross over to the true boiling springs, the one that exists beneath and beyond this bridge, the version of this place that occupies a different layer of reality. You can join us, and you'll never be alone again. You'll understand everything. All your questions will be answered. All the mysteries will be revealed. You'll be part of something ancient, something powerful, something that transcends the meaningless human existence you've been living." The voice continued. "Here, you're solitary. Here, you drive empty roads night after night, and you'll never truly belong. But with us, you'll belong. You'll be part of a community, a collective consciousness, a gathering of beings who perceive reality in ways that most humans can never fathom. We've been waiting for you specifically, James. We've been calling to you since the moment you first saw us. All those miles you've driven, all those years on the road, all of that has been leading you to this moment, to this choice, to this bridge. Choose us, and you'll finally understand what it means to be part of something greater than yourself." James stood there on that bridge, completely surrounded by these entities, completely immobilized by cold and fear and the sheer psychic weight of their presence. His mind was fragmenting under the pressure of the choice they were offering him. Part of him, a part that had been growing stronger during his weeks of obsessive research, found the offer genuinely attractive. The promise of belonging, of understanding, of transcendence. It was seductive. It offered an escape from the loneliness that had defined his existence, but another part of him, deeper and more primal, was screaming at him to run, to flee, to do anything but accept what was being offered. What happened next, what actually occurred on that bridge during those final moments of October 28th, remains completely unknown. All we have is what was left behind. All we have is the physical evidence. And even that evidence raises more questions than it answers. 3 days after James Mitchell disappeared, his truck was found exactly where he'd parked it, undisturbed, untouched. The keys were missing from the ignition. The doors were locked. Inside the cab was the video camera that James had brought with him, the camera that was supposed to be documenting everything that happened on that bridge. Investigators took possession of the camera and attempted to review the footage. What they found was 19 minutes of complete and total darkness, nothing but black screen, no sound, no movement, nothing but absolute void. The audio recorder was also recovered, and it contained the same thing. 58 minutes of the sound of water, a constant rushing sound like a river or rain or a flowing stream, but no voices, no words, no communication of any kind. A search was initiated immediately. Helicopters, search dogs, divers in the river, federal investigators from Pittsburgh, and dozens of volunteer searchers all showed up to look for James Mitchell. They searched for over a week, dragging the river, checking the surrounding woods, interviewing locals, investigating every possible angle. But despite all of that effort, despite the intensity of the search, no trace of James Mitchell was ever found. No body, no clothing, no physical evidence that he'd ever entered the water or gone anywhere else. It was like he'd simply ceased to exist. The Boiling Springs Bridge was temporarily closed to traffic even more strictly than it had been before. Additional barriers were installed, larger warning signs were erected, but significantly, nothing was done to demolish the structure. No one in the local government made any move to tear it down or remove it, despite the fact that it was clearly becoming increasingly dangerous and clearly attracting negative attention. About a week after James disappeared, something started happening in Boiling Springs itself. Residents began reporting strange experiences. A woman claimed to have seen a soaking wet truck driver standing at the entrance to the bridge late at night. A man who looked very much like James Mitchell could have looked, completely drenched, his eyes empty, his presence wrong somehow. More disturbing, paranormal investigators who continued to visit the bridge after James's disappearance began reporting that the activity had intensified significantly. Where there had previously been 1 or 2 manifesting entities, there were now dozens, possibly hundreds of them. The spirits seemed more solid, more present, more real than they'd been before. It was as if James's presence on the bridge, James's decision, whatever that decision had been, had somehow strengthened the connection between the two worlds, had made the barrier even thinner, had emboldened whatever forces were trapped there. Those who study the bridge, those who continue to investigate it despite the obvious danger, have come to believe something that they're generally unwilling to state openly. They believe that James Mitchell didn't disappear, didn't die in any conventional sense, but was instead absorbed by the bridge itself, that he became part of whatever collective entity controls that structure, that he's now part of the gathering of spirits that guards and inhabits that place. Some believe James made a conscious choice to accept the offer that was presented to him, that he voluntarily descended into the river and underwent some kind of transformation. Others believe he was forced, that the spirits simply took him, that they overpowered his will and dragged him into whatever exists beneath that bridge. But the consensus, the underlying belief among those who know the history of the place, is that James Mitchell is no longer dead in any final sense. He's somewhere else, somewhere in between, trapped or transformed, or perhaps something completely different, existing in a state that human language simply doesn't have words to describe. The Boiling Springs Bridge still stands today, still blocked by barriers, still marked with warning signs, still avoided by any driver who knows its history. Every year, Particularly on October 28th, there are reports of unusual activity at the location. Motorists who pass nearby report electrical problems in their vehicles, instruments behaving erratically, GPS systems malfunctioning. Some claim to have seen names carved or written into the bridge's metalwork, names of people carved into the iron as if they'd been marked long ago, marked with a knowing that existed before those people were even born. Others have claimed that if you know where to look, if you know the exact section of bridge to examine, you can find your own name, carved there by forces that knew you were coming, forces that were already claiming you long before you ever found your way to this place. The story of the Boiling Springs Bridge has taken on a life of its own in internet forums and paranormal communities. People who've never been there, people who've only read about it online, swear that they've had experiences connected to the place. They claim to have dreamed about figures emerging from dark water. They claim to have seen phantom hitchhikers on roads leading toward the bridge. They claim that if you research the bridge, if you think about it too much, if you become obsessed with understanding its mysteries, the entities there can sense that attention and will begin to reach out to you across the distance, will begin to make themselves known in your life. The stories have metastasized, spread across the dark corners of the internet, each retelling adding new details, new theories, new alleged evidence of supernatural activity. And here's the thing that makes all of this so genuinely unsettling. We don't have definitive answers to any of the fundamental questions. We don't know what happened to James Mitchell. We don't know exactly what the Boiling Springs Bridge is, whether it's truly a portal or a dimensional weak point or something else entirely that our language doesn't have words for. We don't know why the local government refuses to demolish it, whether it's just bureaucratic inertia or whether they genuinely believe, as some people claim, that demolishing it would unleash something catastrophic. We don't know if the spirits there, if they are spirits, are malevolent or simply trapped and desperate for contact, or something much more complicated than either of those possibilities. All we have are questions and stories, and the physical facts. A bridge that's still there, people who've disappeared, phenomena that can't be explained by conventional means. And if you find yourself driving through Pennsylvania, particularly through the mountain regions near Boiling Springs, particularly after the sun has set, I'd encourage you to avoid that bridge. Find another route, add some extra time to your journey, do literally anything, but drive across that structure when darkness has fallen. Because the truth is, we don't know what's really happening there. We know that something is, something that exists outside normal reality, something that persists despite efforts to ignore it, to forget it, to pretend that it doesn't exist. The bridge is still there, it's still active, it's still waiting. And the entities that inhabit it are still hungry, still patient, still calling out to people like you, like me, like James Mitchell, people who are susceptible to obsession, people who can't resist the pull of a mystery, people who want to understand what lies beyond the normal boundaries of human experience. So what happened to James Mitchell? Did he choose to cross over, to join whatever exists on the other side of that bridge? Did he make a conscious decision to leave his human existence behind? Or was he claimed without consent, pulled into a fate that he couldn't resist? Did he find the answers he was seeking, or did he discover that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved? Did he become part of the collective that now inhabits that bridge, or did something else happen to him entirely? We simply don't know, and maybe that's the most terrifying part of this entire story, not knowing, living with the uncertainty, understanding that there are places in this world, places that exist in the cracks of reality, that operate according to rules we don't understand and can't control. All we know for certain is that James Mitchell drove to the Boiling Springs Bridge on October 28th, and he never came back. Everything else is mystery, speculation, and the stories that people tell to try to make sense of something that fundamentally doesn't make sense within our normal understanding of how reality is supposed to work. Thank you for spending your time with us on the Long Road Stories. If this story resonated with you, if you felt that pull of curiosity about the mysteries that exist in the forgotten corners of this country, please hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, what state or country you call home right now, and let us know if you've ever experienced anything genuinely unexplainable. The truth is out there, on the roads less traveled, in the shadows between the mundane and the impossible, waiting to be discovered by people brave enough or foolish enough to look for it. We'll be back with another story next week. Until then, drive safe, stay aware, and remember, some roads are meant to be traveled during daylight hours only. The Boiling Springs Bridge is definitely one of them.